Okay, picking up where we left off on page 318, talking about XML. And the reason why XML is being used now for this, electronic data interchange thing is because it's all text-based and that anyone can understand it. I can read this and tell what this is about. Clearly, this is a book that has a chapter on hardware, and underneath that, there's some topics for input devices and storage and output devices. I'm just a human and I can read this. Well, humans can read it, machines can read it, other web services, browsers, all sorts of other people can render it. Now, it was not intended to be run directly through your browser. If you were to take this and run this through your browser would say, oh, look, I like markup languages, but I was expecting to see only hypertext markup language, not a generic extensible markup language. So not all markup languages are equal. And this one is all about making data easy to find. Now, the disadvantages is this thing is text-based. That was one of the advantages. Didn't I just say that? One of the advantages is it's text-based and anybody can read it. Okay, cool. One of the disadvantages is it's text-based. And what I'm saying is, let's say, for example, I had an image, okay, a photograph, and I wanted to put that in XML. It's going to have to convert that to text. And when you do that, it grows in size. In fact, it's a 50% growth. So if I had a 1K file, image file, and I put it in XML right off the bat, it's going to be 1.5K right off the bat. And in some cases, it could be a lot bigger than that. I mean, a lot bigger. It could grow in size by 2 or 3 factors. So it's great to be text-based, but text is kind of limiting. So anyway, sometimes it makes things a little slower because the file size could really balloon up big time. Okay, so this is just kind of showing you how if I separate, my cascading style sheet has like the fonts that I use and the colors that I use and the layouts that I use. And if I had an XML file that had, let's say my XML file came from a database, and almost all databases, when you do a query, you can have it format the answer as an XML file. Databases have been able to do this for quite some time. So I have a query, like trying to find out, I'm doing a search for, buying kumquats at some fruit stand. It would go to the database, pull up XML, use this CSS file, and transform it into an honest-to-God web page. So it ends up being an HTML page at the end. Kind of cool. All right, so enough about XML. Next thing they talk about is web programming. Now, this is not a programming class. I'm not going to beat you too much on that. But one more time. In order to make the web first work, it takes 2 pieces. I need a web server, okay, and then I need a client PC, okay? So typically they're called server side and client side. So on the server, I can have lots of things. On the client, I'm typically running a browser, okay? All right, so on the server, this is stuff that I can have. You may have heard of PHP, maybe. It's a hypertext preprocessor. You've probably heard of Java. So I can have these things installed on the server. Now, when I have Java installed on the server, that does not mean I need Java on the client. When I install PHP on the server, that does not mean I need PHP installed on the client. In fact, there is no client version of PHP. And the thing that confuses it is Java, because Java exists in both worlds. It exists both on the server and on the client, and that's a little confusing. Most of the time, that is not the case. Typically, it's not. Okay, so what is available? So on the server would typically be Java and PHP and those kind of things. So in order for me to do some really cool stuff, there could be some plugins. Now the plugin requires me to have something added to my browser. So Adobe Flash plugin or Microsoft Silverlight plugin, things that are installed on my machine. And so if I'm going to use Flash and Silverlight on my server and send you this stuff, you're going to have Flash and Silverlight installed on your browser as a plugin. Now, plugins have come under a great deal of scrutiny nowadays, and in fact, an awful lot of the newer browsers that are out there today are kind of cracking down on plugins. In fact, some of the newer browsers do not support a Java plugin at all. They just figure, at least by default, they have it turned off. A lot of browsers don't include the Adobe version of Flash. They have an embedded Flash thing. So it's not really a plugin. It's something that they can kind of control. So they just license that from the Adobe people, and they did their own thing. Okay, so that's most people are moving away from using Flash and using everything with this new standard called HTML5. It used to be you kind of sort of needed Flash to do some fancy stuff, and Flash-based websites were gorgeous, had cool little animations and little games that you can play and all sorts of cool stuff. But yeah, the price was just kind of too high, so to speak, because of the added potential for disaster. Okay, so that's what that's all about. The next thing they talk about is kind of web services, and I'm going to kind of skip over a great deal of that. And so there are companies out there that sell web services. Google, eBay, Amazon, and of course Microsoft can make available web services. And this is kind of sort of like the thing we talked about before and the demo I did with Azure, where I just go to some company and give them money, and they produce a web page for me or a database on the cloud or whatever it is, and then I don't have to deal with the whole thing at all. So we kind of sort of talked about this. And web services are typically based upon the XML. If I'm passing data between a web service and a client, practically all of them are going to be using XML. And that's designed so that it's kind of industry standard. Everyone understands it because the available choices. In fact, we are almost crippled by the number of choices. If you're a web developer and that's what you do for a living, your head is spinning because every 10 minutes somebody comes up with some new web service and some new feature that you're going to have to deal with. So it's such a fluid thing, is we need standards-based thing. And I'm not going to go through all the rest of this junk, but just suffice it to say that, web services typically use XML. Okay, let's move on. The next one talks about authoring. So let's say that you wanted to write your own web page, or you want to contribute to a web page that's already out there. Then you need some tools that allow you to do that. Dreamweaver is one that's been out there for quite some time. It's a fantastic setup. Here's one called Expression Web. Now, the Microsoft Web Matrix is another one. So Web Matrix and Expression Web are fantastic free tools from Microsoft, and they are top notch. I mean top notch. There's a third one out there now called Visual Studio Code, and it is very good. And these things, the Visual Studio Code is not, these guys, Expression Web and Web Matrix, those were designed to install only on Windows machines. But Visual Studio Code, you can install it on a Mac, you can install it on a Linux box, whatever, and it's a dang good editor kind of a thing. Okay, Dreamweaver, been around for quite some time. It uses term WYSIWYG, you've probably heard that. It stands for what you see is what you get. They invented that term way back in the word processing days, when before you were just using markup and you couldn't actually see what it was going to look like until you actually printed it. So that's what this is all about. By the way, when I teach the CISK450 course, I use Web Matrix. Okay, that's a good tool. Price is right too. Woohoo! When I do it now, I use Visual Studio. Okay, that's how I do my web pages. There's some thing talks about responsive web design. It talks about providing customized layout for devices, and the idea is that when the web was created, almost everyone was using a desktop machine. And now that's just not the case. And so a lot of people spend an enormous amount of time making sure that their web pages are viewable on smaller screens. Or if I'm holding it in landscape versus portrait, or a tinier screen, and so it's all about screen sizes and orientation and pixel density and all the rest of those things. And so this is where people are spending a great deal of time. I want to be able to create one web page that sits on a web server that renders differently depending on what device. If I have 5 different devices, I want to render slightly differently depending on whether it's a small screen or a big screen, or if I'm holding it landscape or portrait or da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Anyway, so it's all about getting the mobile computing people all happy. That's what it's all. A lot of these companies have, if you've ever worked with WordPress, everything is done with a template. They have these design frameworks. It's like a template. You pick one out. You say, okay, that's what I want my web page to look like, and then you just fill in the blank. So you're not actually doing any coding whatsoever. You don't have to know anything at all about HTML or HTTP or any of those other alphabet soup type of acronyms. All you do is you grab a template and start typing, and presto changeo, you have a web page. There's a lot of those out there, and they're actually pretty decent. In fact, they typically look pretty doggone good. Probably better than the stuff that I produce. Okay. They talk about, Web 2.0, and this is the term that just kind of goes crazy. Internet web applications. And 2.0 is all about the idea that, instead of just having static content, the user can contribute. So Facebook and Flickr and Instagram and all these guys are all about providing just a framework for the customer to add content for other people to see. So it's not about, the companies build practically no content whatsoever. They're just waiting for you to come around and build content. That's what Web 2.0 is all going to be about. Another example they talk about is called a rich internet application. So RIA, there's even an acronym for it. So here's, for example, a calculator. So if I go in here and I type in some numbers and hello, what on earth? My calculator doesn't work. Ah! That is terrible. Let me hit refresh here. Okay. Yay! Cool. So I type in some numbers and I, do some stuff. And okay, now does this look like a web page to you guys? It is. It's a web page, but it's a web application. It doesn't look like a web page at all. It just looks like a calculator. So that's what that's all about. Okay. So Web 2.0 and rich internet application, those are kind of cool terms. I'm going to skip a great deal of this section on the online information sources. I mean, there's an entire section in here that talks about, the social web. And, oh, come on. I mean, come on. You guys know about Facebook and Twitter and Google. I'm not going to spend hardly any time on that at all. I'm going to skip over. In fact, the next thing I'm going to talk about is on page 330. We talk about search engines, because there is some cool stuff that you can learn about search engines. So news and education, all the rest of that junk. LinkedIn. So just, again, moving right along. And now we get to search engines. Now, if you're a really good, search engine guru, you know some of these things. If I type in vacation space Hawaii, implied in that is there's an and, a logical operator in there that basically says I want something where the words vacation and Hawaii both appear. If I said Maui or Hawaii, which means either one of those. And then things that are in quotes and these little symbols and pluses. So this is actually some good stuff. If you want to get good at, you can go to this little Google's help page and it'll give you some very cool hints and some cool examples on how all that stuff works. But this is a good place to stop for the 15-minute mark, and we'll pick that thing up in just a second.